Jinky my name is Evelyn Araluen and I am coming to you today from the lands of the Woiwurrung Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations. I would just like to acknowledge that it is their sovereignty, that it is their care for country, that is keeping this land healthy, particularly throughout the quite scary time that we're all finding ourselves in. And I would just like to ensure that my respects are paid to their ongoing custodianship of their country that I'm very lucky to be a part of as I am living and working here in the Kulin Nations. So today I'm going to be talking with you about this idea of writing self-care and what self-care might mean for you as young people in a year of many disasters and calamities and difficulties and a lot of struggles. So this is something that I would like you to be thinking about, not necessarily just in terms of how can you produce a piece of writing, how can you create some kind of content, but rather more so to be thinking about how can you develop and create your voice so that you are able to speak to and of and about the time that you find yourself in right now. How can you think about a couple of tips and skills, some frameworks, some different terms and a few different activities so that you can develop your voice and ensure that the work that you are producing right now, that the writing that you are creating to document your experiences, your thoughts, your ideas, your hopes and your fears might be a part of a kind of lifelong project of caring for the self, of looking out for yourself and trying to ensure that you are always able to sort of speak to and of yourself and be confident that the voice that you are presenting is the voice that you have developed yourself. It's the voice that you want. It's the voice that you want other people to be able to hear. So we're going to talk about a couple of different ideas today. The first thing that I wanted to think about was this first idea of self-care. So we hear this term quite a lot now, I think. It's probably a term that you've encountered yourself quite a lot, whether that might be online, it might be in school, it might be in, in media, in television and in social media. We have a couple of definitions so far of what self-care might mean. I think it's a term that we're all sort of coming to individually understand. While it is in, the Western world, quite a popular, it's a trendy term right now, I think we can all agree that a lot of these ideas of looking out for the self, of healing, of centering the self, of mindfulness, and any other kind of associated practice has a really, really long cultural history. And it has a lot of different formations for different individuals, just depending on what linguistic background, what ethnic, cultural background they came from, what their life experiences might be. Now, obviously, self-care looks different for every single person. And another caveat that we should be mentioning is that self-care as a term has itself kind of recently been co-opted by a lot of media and by a lot of companies and organizations. We all need things. We absolutely all need things. But we don't need things to have personal human value and personal human integrity, nor do we need this competitive nature of things when we are trying to do our best to live in communities, to live in different relationships, different ideas of solidarity, and different ideas of taking care of each other. But it comes back to the old adage that before you can look after other people, you always have to look after yourself. So whatever your level of access, whatever your level of affordability, writing is something that for most people we can just do as a part of our everyday lifestyles. Understanding always that literacy and the access that it affords is never a given, and there are always going to be challenges and problems associated with that. We should never assume that something that is accessible to us is going to be accessible to somebody else. But in the context of this workshop, I'm hoping that we can think about different forms of writing, different forms of documentation and of witness as something that everybody has access to, no matter what level, no matter what expertise, no matter what talent. All right, we're not going for perfection here. The goal of whatever we get out of this conversation, out of this workshop, should not be perfection. Rather, we're just thinking about how we can record, how we can observe, and how we can use the words that we are creating as a way of giving some kind of care and some kind of kindness to yourself. The point out of all of the exercises and discussions that I'm going to have with you today is not to make the world around you seem palatable, appropriate, understandable, tolerable, particularly not when we know that the world is very much full of injustice right now. But rather the point is to be honest, to bear witness, and to work on your language of talking about the world that you live in. The language that you get out of these kinds of activities and experiences should all be a part of a broader project of making sure that you are able to speak to and of and about and for the time that you are living in. That you are able to look what we are going through together collectively, or what we are going through, what you might be going through individually, in the eye and say, I know you and I can talk about you. Here is what I have written. So, those are the objectives of this conversation that we're having about self-care and writing today. I have a couple of activities that I'm going to take you through, and I'm going to show you how I've myself constructed a poem about self-care in the middle of stage 4 lockdowns in Melbourne. We can think about our experiences in a global pandemic as a kind of witnessing. We are witnessing a global event that has never happened like this before. Your witness and the testimonial that you provide from this period is novel, it's new, it's interesting. It's something that can be helpful for you as well as for other people who might be looking back on this period trying to understand what has occurred. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we actually get into some of the writing and practices of writing that I'd like to discuss with you today is this idea of presenting or protecting the private. We're talking about writing as a form of self-care here. We're not necessarily at the stage of thinking about how you might want to present or distribute that writing. We're just really trying to think about the process and what it might mean to you as a practice in looking out for yourself and trying to think about how you can record and document what you're going through, what your thoughts are, what your experiences are. However, the audience is always kind of going to shape the work that you're producing, and some kind of expectation of readership, of being seen, is always present when we're creating any kind of memory, any kind of document of ourselves and our perspectives, whether that's a photo that you're taking, or that's a diary entry, or that's a short story that you're going to write for your final exams. You're always kind of conscious of what expected level of readership you might be getting for whatever that work might be. You might wish to be the only person that ever sees that work, and I think it's really important that you allow yourself the capacity to create work that is solely for your own eyes. I've written stories and I've written pieces and poems that I don't really want to share. They're something that I like to come back to years later and enjoy. It's nice to read something that you know comes from your own voice and is really meant for your own ears. So giving yourself this own personal kind of writing experience can be wonderful, and you want to protect those private thoughts and you want to ensure that they are always there for you and not for anybody else's gaze. That just comes down to some really basic tenets of, if you're using cloud storage, make sure that you have private folders and public folders. Make sure that you are keeping backup copies. Maybe you want to email work to yourself. Maybe you just like to have stuff on your computer. Maybe you like to use a diary or a journal or the notes app on your phone. Like, whatever it is for you. We'll talk about that in a minute, but just make sure that you're just basically aware of the rules of privacy around that medium. When it comes to presenting the private, that's a little bit more complicated and it takes a little bit of courage. That might be something that you're ready for already. It might be something that you're already doing. It might be something that you never want to have to worry about. It's not really relevant so much for this conversation, but to think about vulnerability for a moment, It's really easy to be vulnerable about topics that we have as a society determined to be vulnerable. Love and heartbreak and the body and desire and grief. These are all things that we kind of naturally associate with an idea of vulnerability. However, it's just as easy to be performative about those ideas and never actually be vulnerable about them. There can be things that you might feel really anxiously about and that you might have a lot of difficulty being open about that are perfectly natural for the next person sitting right next to you. Don't be afraid of vulnerability when it comes to writing as it relates to self-care, but also don't force yourself to be performative over something if you don't really feel it or experience it. When you go back and look at that writing, do you want to see a different version of yourself than the version that you actually went through that experience or that event with? Or do you want to feel like you're meeting an old friend again? It doesn't really matter so much when you're just starting out. But if you're trying to create a broader structure or pattern of engaging with your own thoughts, reflections, witnessing your own journaling or your own poetry or your own personal essays, you might want to try to think about what's a personal, what's a private, what's a, an internal thought or experience, and what's something that you feel communicates yourself or your ideas to an outside audience. Don't delete, don't hide things away. You'd be really surprised at the importance of the thoughts that you didn't think would make it into the final product. It's really important that you keep that novelty and the rawness of certain bits of writing so that you can come back to them later on. But don't feel compelled to present everything. And certainly don't feel compelled to present everything at once. Your writing might be for you, it might be for your mum, it might be for your whole community, it might be for the whole world. You get to choose that audience, you get to choose what goes into that or what goes out of that. But just from experience, I discourage you from just habitually deleting everything. It's nice to go back and try to remember what drove you to write something or what thoughts were going on at a particular time in your life. We make memories through documenting, through novelty, through experience. Writing as a form of self-care can sometimes be a way of writing to give yourself memories that you might have otherwise lost. So, if you're worried about overthinking, if you're scared of too directly encountering difficult emotions, if you just feel like you're going to need a little bit of space from whatever you're going to be writing about, it might be very emotionally charged, it might be even a little bit provocative, or it might even just be something that's just linked to desire or hope or something that you're maybe not as comfortable with as you would like. Write about it in the third person. Try to extrapolate out of yourself and try to see how these emotions can look projected onto a different body, a different mind, a different environment, just something that's outside of yourself. Writing about yourself in the third person is actually a really strange and eerie experience, but I really recommend it. It does allow you to kind of organize your thinking and take yourself out of your own context for a little bit and think about how you might be presented to other people. Don't overdo it. That's when you start accidentally talking about yourself in the third person and people get weirded out by that. If you're feeling hopeless, if you're feeling quite defeated by the present or the environment that you're in right now, if you're feeling really challenged by the context that you're in, why don't you write from the future or write from the past? Take yourself out of the temporality, or maybe even take yourself out of the location and see if maybe your feelings change outside of that constraint. If you're feeling powerless or limited, why not try writing to someone who has power? Why not think about writing to a version of yourself with the things that you want? Give yourself a little bit of wish fulfillment in this piece. This writing activity asks you to look at that stock of inspiration that you've been collecting. So, what's your favorite song lyric or your favorite quote? Pretending that it's yours for a moment, create a short piece of writing with that line. Now, obviously, that's itself a little bit sketchy, a little bit plagiarism-y, but we're talking about writing as a form of self-care here, so don't hold yourself to an insanely high standard. So I would use writing prompts from song lyrics all of the time when I was teaching creative writing, because I would always remember a line that had some kind of jarring impact on me, And I would just enjoy the experience of sharing that line with a room full of people who would have a similar or a different experience, take a completely different perspective to that line, completely transform and reimagine it. Don't feel worried about copying if it's just for the process of just trying to get yourself started. And you're going to give your own interpretation of that line anyway. So just roll with it for a little bit. It might be the first line of a short story. It might be the concept for a personal essay. It might be a part of a found poem in which you've collected multiple forms of inspiration. You're rearranging and creating new meanings. Whatever it is, it's a really nice way of you enjoying other people's creative work while extending that and exploring why you like it so much. You'd be surprised what comes out of that forced constraint of starting with somebody else's words, putting them in your mouth and hearing how they sound when they come out of your throat. Using the prompt, let me explain, write a monologue. Imagine it's addressed to someone in the future. I've set this writing activity before, and I've tried to encourage people to write something that would go into a time capsule or would go into a satellite that was expected to be found in the future. I'm not setting a time limit on this. It could be a monologue that you've written that you expect to be found by yourself tomorrow morning when you wake up and you realize that you wrote yourself an entire monologue and left it on your desk. Or it could be something that you think a stranger is going to find in 20 years. But you want to start with that phrase, let me explain. It's the kind of phrase that incites anxiety even when I hear it. It's like, let me explain. I'm like, oh God, what's been done? What have you done? What do you need to apologize for? What do I need to worry about? But even that presents itself like a really tantalizing opportunity to think about how we imagine events and how we imagine perspective and action involved with events. I use this prompt to try to write to, whoever finds a satellite, and the satellite is all that is left of humanity and it's all that is left of the earth. And I use this prompt, let me explain, and I talk about how we ended up here. It was very cynical, and I don't recommend doing that for self-care, but it was a really interesting exercise, and I ended up with a really cool poem once I pared back the frameworks and all of the eccentricities and all of the repetition, and just end up with the bare bones of this prompt. It turned out to be a really cool poem. The last writing activity that I would encourage you to think about is to write something kind to someone. This sounds so simple and so innocuous, but again, you'd be really surprised about what comes out of the experience. Immediately, you're forced to think about who do you want to be kind to. If you are really looking for a challenge, write something kind to an enemy. Write something kind to somebody who you've had a falling out with. Write some kind of extension of generosity to somebody who you feel is not deserving. And then see where that takes you, because you can really interestingly undermine yourself in writing and create a space for exploration and experimentation when you start with something you don't want to do. It's not for me to say that you should forgive your enemies, but it's really interesting when you write as if you think you've got them as an audience. It's a lot of fun. Habits and routines of writing. Whether you like structured writing or unstructured writing, you want to think about your everyday writing. How often is writing a part of the life that you live? I'm guessing it's a pretty constant part of your everyday, whether it's text messages, doing homework, whether it is reading and responding to signs around your neighborhood, whether it is typing in the names of a show on Netflix or a Google search, whatever it is, you write every day and you engage with literature, with art, with media in some form or another every single day. You might want to think about habit as opposed to actual structure. Maybe having a desk that you sit down at 10 a.m. and that you pump out 5,000 words a day out is, your favorite thing in the world. And maybe that's what gives you motivation and keeps you going in your work. For me, I like to have my desk always ready. I like to have it always clear and know that whenever I sit down and open a document that I've got everything set up in the way that I like it. part of my writing practice is trying to keep the house relatively clean so that I'm not constantly getting distracted and moving a cup into the kitchen every 30 seconds and I'm trying to write and get a thought down. Maybe you want to avoid distraction. Maybe you love distraction. I've written entire poems on walks, just in the notes app. I've written essays while I was traveling 6 different countries in the space of a month. Whatever works for you is going to work for you. And if we're thinking specifically about writing as a form of self care, it really is just something that you should allow yourself to experience and form organically. However, sometimes writer's block, sometimes just basic reluctance. For me, a lot of it is laziness, might be a problem that you have to face in your kind of everyday experience of writing and producing work. I like to give myself some kind of reflexive thinking, and if I'm really bad and I really, really need to create new work, I will give myself writing exercises. I'm going to give you a couple in a minute, and we can talk about how we can create some writing self-care pieces. However, just before I get to that, I'm just going to try to talk just a little bit more about how you set yourself up for the best possible experience and the best possible content to go into those writing exercises. Documenting thoughts and observations. That should be something relatively habitual for you. You want to work out the best possible method for you and try to make sure that it's something that you can actually take some kind of enjoyment from. Growing up, was a journal girl. I loved having sketchbooks. I loved having really beautiful diaries that I could write in. I really tried to make sure that I was constantly making them pretty and that I had a nice balance of visual and written. I would write quotes that I liked. I would write notes to myself. I would do pictures and drawings. It was chaotic a little bit, but most of the time I liked it. Really hard to maintain, however. And now I just don't have the kind of time to get through an entire sketchbook or journal once every month or 2 months. I don't like putting all of my thoughts into multiple different places. I try to, as much as possible, keep a few sort of structured things. So, as I have mentioned before, I have the notes app in my phone. I have written so many poems in that I have then had to email myself and had to edit with all kinds of weird grammatical things coming up just because autocorrect hates my language. I have Word doc. I will use Google Doc. I'll use all kinds of cloud methods, but normally about once a week I try to compile everything and just make sure all of the versions that I need are up to date. So if I'm ever in a situation where I've got a reading or I have to go and, desperately edit a piece because I've just thought of a new line, I always like to know where it is. So you want to give yourself a little bit of a routine to make sure that things aren't getting away from you. But you want to make sure that it's organic enough that you can always write something down at any particular time that you might be inclined to do so. So make sure that whatever tools of the trade you want to use, they're adjusted to you, they suit your lifestyle, they suit your expectations and your habits, but try to just give yourself one little thing that you can kind of make a little bit more ceremonial, a little bit more sacred about the whole process. It's nice. It's a comforting, kind experience to give yourself. So set yourself up for that. Don't be afraid to diverge from that structure, but also similarly, don't be afraid to set yourself some tasks and expectations around it. Making sure that your desk is nice and pretty, that you like your space, that you have plenty of nice pens in a nice little pen cup. I got this one from the Moomin shop when I went to London for a research trip. So every time I see it, it reminds me of that. I have my plant that I miraculously haven't killed. I'll have whatever book I'm currently reading. At the moment, I'm reading Laura Elvery's Ordinary Matter. Anything sort of nearby, but I like to make sure that my space is always as clear as it possibly can be. So I've got my space. I've made sure that I've got a limited amount of distractions. I've made sure that I've set it up in a way that feels homely and nice and comfortable. Got my family photo, got my plant, got my pretty little pen cup, got my book that I'm reading, got one of my favorite books down here in case I ever need it. I always try to make sure that I am collecting and compiling inspiration and that I know where that is and I know how I've documented and recorded that, okay? I'm at the stage where I don't like it to clutter my work too much because I hyperfixate. So if I were to put a document of all of my favorite quotes above my desk, which I've done in the past, unfortunately that means that I basically just end up rewriting all of my favorite quotes. Sometimes fun, normally frustrating, because if you hold yourself to the standard that you're never really going to meet because you're just too obsessed with what somebody else has done, you're probably not going to have a fun time. I like to make sure that I'm always collecting and compiling illustration across a couple of methods. So I make sure that on my social media platforms that I use the save function as opposed to the like function. So I'm always making sure that I know exactly where any content that's inspired me or encouraged me to think in a new way, or lines that I just aesthetically like, or images that I want to write about, I know where they are, and I can always, if I'm having some writer's block, if I'm just having a difficult time, if I don't even feel like creating, but I just want to enjoy work and just be reminded of why I think writing is a good thing, I know where to find that, and I can always go and sink into that. It helps that it's compartmentalized because it means that I'm not too overwhelmed. So I know that if I go and check my folders in Instagram, I'm going to be able to see some really beautiful visual poetry and quotes and text, etc. Stuff that's presented in a really interesting and compelling way. I know that if I check my folders on Twitter, that I'm going to get short, sharp, sometimes deeply impactful statements. I know that if I check Facebook, I'll have saved links, I'll have all kinds of pages and things recorded there. Then I'll keep my bookmarks on my computer in different folders. Then I'll make sure that I have a folder of screenshots of things that I've seen online. And then I've got a Word document that I'm constantly updating, full of quotes and lines that I really, really love. To get to some of the activities that I think you might want to try or that can be helpful for you to think about writing as self-care and writing as an activity to kind of ground the self and reflect on the self in a quite chaotic time. I've got a couple of prompts and I've got a couple of frameworks. So let's begin with these frameworks. To give yourself some kind of imperative, some kind of focus for your writing. I've got 3 different sorts of frameworks you can position yourself in that should apply to any of these particular activities. I, as a child, as a teenager, used to write stories where I had blonde hair and blue eyes because I thought that was exactly what you needed to be beautiful and desirable. And now I realize that that is, a little bit messed up, and I wish that I'd been the kind of person who wanted to reframe these expectations and these stereotypes. But you know what? I was a kid and I was writing for wish fulfillment. I was writing as a reflection of the media that I was taught to consume. And you know what? I had a nice time. I had a fun time. And I've learnt and I've grown and I've reflected. And my experience of writing about a blonde-haired, blue-eyed character that was really just a self-insert of myself, it hasn't given me any kind of permanent damage, I hope. So those are just a couple of kinds of mindsets you can place yourself in to explore some of these questions. Some don't apply as easily to those frameworks, but they're all just for the purpose of trying to initiate your first attempt. Nothing about a writing prompt is ever supposed to constrain or to force any kind of limitation on the end product. Sometimes what we call a forced constraint is really useful to just get you going. And then what you do with it after that process is where your originality and where your process is really going to shine. The first activity that I encourage you to try is to write an answer to the question, how are you? Now, don't just write fine and be done with it. Or if you write fine, then start extrapolating. Start going beyond. What do you wish you could say when somebody asked you that question? What are you hiding from that answer? Push yourself, keep writing, force yourself to just write and write and write until you've rewritten the same thing 20 times and you know what it is you want to say in answer to that question. Write a letter to someone you're worried about. It could be you, it could be a family member, it could be someone from the past, it could be somebody from the future. whatever it is, try to give yourself the space and the kindness outside of your own personal situation to offer advice, to offer counsel, to offer some kind of support, some kind of emotional energy towards someone going through something that you wish that they weren't. You would be surprised at how much kindness can come out of your own mouth or out of your own pen that you would not have necessarily extended to yourself once you take yourself out of that immediate self-dialogue. Once you give yourself the forced constraint of a letter and say, this is going out of my hands and it's going to somebody else, it's going somewhere else into some futurity. This is not me saying this to a mirror, this is me saying this to a page, and whether this page comes back to me or not, this is for the page first and for the reader second. You would be astounded at the kinds of things that you're willing to say to a page that you were never willing to say to yourself. It's a really good thing. I'm going to do the self-indulgent thing, and I'm going to talk about one of my pieces. I'm going to talk about the experience that I've had over the last couple of months being in lockdown, still in stage 4 lockdown at the moment, and trying to use writing as its own particular form of self-care. I've had a lot of writing that I've had to do. I've had grant applications, I've had emails to send, I've had administration to deal with, I've had uni work, and I've had a book to complete, I've had editing, all of these different kinds of writing. So I've tried to, every day make sure that I've set aside a little bit of time just at the end of the day. Normally for me, it's after dinner before I've decided if I want to watch a movie. Used to be able to take the dog for a walk, can't do that anymore. Do I want to play some Animal Crossing, whatever that might be. I like to just set aside a little bit of time to just clear my head and to just center myself on the written page. So I've been pretty far away from my family in this whole quarantine pandemic experience. And as an Aboriginal person, my family is really, really important to me. I'm used to living in a household of 10 people, and I'm suddenly living, with myself, my partner, and a dog in a city I don't really know, where I don't really have any family. So this has kind of been getting a little bit difficult for me, and I've been trying to think self-reflexively about the different experiences that I'm aware that I'm missing right now, things that I'm used to, habits that I'm used to that are really important to me that I just don't have access to at the moment. I found myself on the phone with my parents every other night, documenting little things that I know that they're doing that I wish I could be there for. So taking the dogs for a walk, or having dinner with all of my siblings screaming at each other, different sorts of things that I would enjoy and I would really miss. One thing that I've noticed that I don't get a lot of is telling stories and talking about memory and history and, bringing up old anecdotes and old grudges and grievances. That's something that, that's important, and it's important to try to make sure that when you don't have that you've got other ways of keeping memory going and other ways of connecting to your identity and your sense of self. So I was for a long time building up notes and observations that were all just directed towards the grief, that were all just directed towards this feeling of anxiety and separation, wondering if they're telling me everything that's going on, if something's happened, and would they let me know? What if Dad got sick? What if my brother was in a car accident? What if my sister looks different when I get home? And these sorts of anxieties. And I found that the process of writing and editing this work was actually really only just recentering my grief and recentering this feeling of dislocation. I was putting lines together like, one day I'll learn to miss something without wanting it back. And I realized that I was just forcing myself into this repetitive, painful process of just going through this disruption to my routine, going through this disruption to my family, almost as if I expected I'd never see them again. And then somewhere down the line, I started trying to shift my thinking, not as it related to writing, but actually when I was cleaning the house, I started to think, you know what? It's going to be really nice when Mum and Dad come down and see this. It's going to be really nice when my sister stays for a weekend, or when my brother and his wife come down and they see this place and they see Melbourne for the first time. I started thinking of how I could decorate the room in such a way that I knew that they would like it when they saw it, how I could make sure that we had enough space for a daybed upstairs so someone could stay, planting flowers in the courtyard that I knew that my parents would like. These little tiny practices and habits of trying to prepare my home, my space for the people that I loved so that they could come back to me when I can come back to them. Those are little habits that I was building that slowly started to seep into my writing. I found myself writing little notes about things that I hoped and that I desired to do. I was on a walk with my dog and I was thinking about how much my family would really like the park that we take her to, and how I think they'd have a really fun time there, and how we need to have a picnic there sometime. And I called home and they were just sitting down to dinner. And it was a really, really lovely, nice experience to hear them in a space that was simultaneously so devoid of them, but that had all of this hope and this potential. I heard my sister calling in the background, "I'll see you soon," when the phone hung up. And that was the sort of message that I hear all the time when I'm back at home, when I'm in Sydney with my family. "Oh, I'll see you soon," because we're all in that house at least once a week, all together at least once a week together. So I found myself writing down this line, "See you tonight." That was something that, just was an innocuous kind of phrase. "Oh, I'll see you tonight." I'm going to the shops right now, but I'll see you tonight. And I then, from that one individual phrase, just started finding little lines and little observations, little things that I hoped to do, little things that I was looking forward to. I was thinking about little routines and patterns. I was thinking about nieces and nephews, and they're getting older and I haven't been able to brush their hair or, see them get taller or anything like that. I was thinking about those stories that we weren't being able to laugh over at the dinner table. So I started writing these little notes, these little promises. And I found again that I was just coming back to this idea of being so far away from them. It was starting to come into being a list of all of the things that I planned to do with my family when I saw them next. And I realized at some point in the development of this piece, well, if I'm so obsessed with the idea of being there with them and of returning home, why don't I write this as if I'm still home right now? Why don't I write this as a way of thinking fondly of myself? And you can see different notes and you can see different half-attempted lines. I'll take you to the final version now. The final version that I ended up with, and I'm going to read it to you. "See you tonight. We're losing light now, but never rhythm, spilling between house and yard. Mum's got her feet up, and I'm making that curry you all like. Dad's in the shed, but he'll hear if we call. The sky burns vermilion behind the gum stretching from our trickle of South Creek, a corella keening in its hollow. Every night is this one, the same sun browning our shared limbs on its way to sink over city that's too far for us to care. Take long walks, play with the dogs. Tell me how was work after I scream at you for stealing my shoes again. Did you see that big roo coming in? Heat rising from the scrub. Go look at Mum's new quilt. She used the red blossom print you liked. At the table, tell the one about finding the owl in the van. Remember those white gums across from the old house. We always said we'd swim the dam one day. You play bunyip, I'll be drop bear. Your arms still hurt some nights from my bike. So do my dreams. If all we get from history is each other, isn't that plenty? I hope this living is long enough for me to bathe your children, to brush their hair. I'm saving them that book of bush songs, those gumnut onesies. Cicadas wail to the moon watching us above silhouettes. Didn't she ever tell you that one? It's all good. I will. I will. I will. This poem for me became a promise of a future that was actually my past. And in writing about something that I couldn't necessarily access, I was giving it a space in this carefully presented little room that I've made for myself, this little corner of a house that is missing my family, that is missing those routines, that is missing the care and the kindness that comes out of that proximity. I was able to give them some kind of presence here, more so than just a photo above my desk. These are the kinds of linked actions that can arise out of writing self-care. This promise to myself, this promise to the future of my family, this promise to the continuity of the way that we've done things and of the kindness and the care that arises out of our proximity. Writing self-care doesn't always resolve every particular issue that you're going through in your life. Nothing can. No art can make the unbearable right. It can't fix that. It can't erase that. But it can help us understand it. And through our own understanding, we can work towards different resolutions, different forms of happiness, different forms of tenderness and experience. We're really good. We're really good at convincing ourselves of how we feel about things, but sometimes you learn a lot in the process. So I was learning in the process of writing this, the particular things that I missed the most. I thought that I missed, my town. I thought that I missed my family. And I realized as I was writing about the Corellas in the back, I was writing about the dogs. I was writing about even screaming at my siblings. These tiny little moments that I would otherwise just pass over in an everyday at home with my family, they came back. They came back for me to enjoy them and for me to kind of hold them in a new place and introduce them to new ideas and new experiences. It's a good experience. It's a really nice thing to do for yourself. So I really recommend you try to think about those locales, those relationships, those dialogues across time and place. What does it mean to care for ourselves in a time of chaos, in a time of harm, in a time of great difficulty? We're living in a very uncertain period. It is hard to know what is wrong or what is right. It is hard to know what our lives will look like next year. The only thing you can really try to do in such uncertainty is search for new ways of being kind to yourself, kind to the people in your lives, kind to the communities that have remained throughout these struggles. Documenting, witnessing, compiling, collecting memories of your everyday in the form of the written word is a really beautiful way of ensuring that the lives that we live grow bigger and larger for the memories that we have associated with them. Creating new habits and new routines of recording your environment, recording your day-to-day, of recording your hopes, your dreams, your fears, your desires, through writing, through documenting, through collaging, through giving record to experiences that are unprecedented in our time is a really important function of listening and being aware of the environment that we're in and trying to make sure that if we are ever asked to speak on what needs to change, that we know exactly what our voice is and what our voice is able to do. To write self-care is to know that there is value in speaking to yourself, to know that there is value in creating a written record of who you are, of what you think, of what you have been through, of what you have thought, of what you have fought for even. These are all things that should become a part of your habit, a part of your routine, and importantly, a part of the care that you show to yourself in your everyday, whether it be that you're winding down from school or work, whether it be that you're giving yourself morning affirmations so that you can try to place yourself in the kindest, the most generous, the most powerful mindset that you can have for that day, whether it be that you're trying to better articulate yourself when you speak to your mom or your grandma, or when you speak to yourself in the future, or whether it just be that you're trying to create an outlet. So somewhere where you can try to clarify what is going on in a time of chaos. Try to bring yourself back to a couple of material realities, a couple of tangible, touchable things in your environment that allow you to use your words to express your ideas, your thoughts, and to give them a presence, to give them a place in the routine of your everyday. To recap on a couple of things that we talked about, it's important that you create a space where you feel comfortable, a space where you feel enriched and enlightened, somewhere that you have plenty of inspiration, somewhere that you can feel that you have control over what you're doing in your everyday. Try to make sure that you're understanding the difference of energies that you're putting into your work. Are you angry about something? Do you want to write against it? Do you just want to document something so you know how you felt at the time? So when you come back to this very confusing event or this period, that you're able to see something of yourself in the event that occurred. Understand that it is okay to like something and to take pleasure in something that is problematic, as long as you're aware and as long as you're engaging with a critical and a kind voice. Remember how to protect the personal and remember how to distinguish between the performance of privacy and the exploitation of vulnerability. Build habits, routines, structures. Build a space that is inviting for you. Build a space that wants your voice and that knows how to accept it. Collect and compile inspiration. Keep it with you, grow it. Remember that there is just something beautiful about knowing what you have loved and what you have liked and coming back to it later and seeing how it transforms throughout the years of your life. And remember, most importantly, the point of writing self-care, the point of writing the self, the point of documenting who you are, what you've thought, what you've been through in your everyday, in this time of instability, is that it is not your job to make your world palatable, appropriate, or understandable. It's not your job to make sense of the nonsensical, of the completely chaotic and out of control. Your job is to be honest to yourself, honest to your voice, honest to your environment, to your community. Bear witness. You never know what will come of it. You never know how you will feel 20 years down the line reading what you as a young person wrote, just as we started to realize how things in our lives were changing. You never know the power that comes out of taking control of your voice as early as you possibly can. You never know the power that comes out of understanding that developing and crafting and reflecting on your voice is the kindness that you can show yourself that will last a lifetime. Thank you for joining me for this conversation. I hope that it has been in some way enriching or inspiring. I hope that you produce work out of it. I hope you produce writing. I hope you produce some habits. It's not about the product, it's about the process. And I hope the process is good to you, and I hope you are good to yourselves. Thank you.